short little video where I talked about the top 5 things I liked and didn't like about the free trial of Final Fantasy XIV. But as I started to write and rewrite, it became clear that I had a lot more that I wanted to say about this game. More importantly, I wanted to be able to share my thoughts and experiences about my time with this game, while I still felt passionate enough to do so. This has been a journey that I have been on for about 8 months now, with some highs and lows in between. I started the game on the trial back during Christmas of last year, with my only intention being to poke my nose in and see what it was that my friends have been up to. You can now make fun of me, as I have been poking my nose in for about 1,000 hours now, and I thought that the community might be interested in hearing about my experience with the game, considering my unique circumstance. All that being said, I will not be doing a review of Final Fantasy XIV, because for all intents and purposes, and I'm sure the community would agree with me, I did not play Final Fantasy XIV. I played the trial, specifically the expanded free trial, which allows you to play through the entirety of A Realm Reborn and the award-winning Heavensward expansion up to level 60 for free, with no restrictions on playtime. Playing the game on a trial means that there are certain restrictions placed upon you. There is a cap on your guild, and you can only join a party if invited or by using the Duty Finder. There is no access to the market board, and you cannot trade other players or whisper them. These were clearly put in place to stop bot accounts from harassing other players or adversely affecting the market, but it has the fun side effect of imposing a number of challenges for long-term trial players that they will have to overcome. It also means that, for the most part, you will have to be entirely self-reliant, as other players are unable to interact with you for the most part outside of queues. It makes you see things a little bit differently. Gil, for one, becomes worthless, and players begin to look a bit more like NPCs that become uncomfortable when you stare at them for long periods of time. And that is what I meant about me having the wrong opinion, as it is sort of hard for me to have a objectively correct opinion, as a permanent free trial is something that Square Enix never intended. Obviously, a free trial is meant to entice you into purchasing the full game, lift the restrictions, and finally experience the real thing. If this were a supermarket, Square Enix would be standing at their table, offering a plate full of pepperoni samples, or whatever, with the actual product sitting just behind them, hoping to entice new consumers. However, I, as a connoisseur of sorts, entered the store already knowing what I wanted. I'll still take the free pepperoni though, and it's good pepperoni, don't get me wrong. But I didn't come to the store for pepperoni. I did, however, greedily eat 4 more samples. When asked what I thought of those samples, I reply, "It's good. I like it." A passerby may hear this and tell me that they buy that brand of pepperoni all the time, and that the best way to experience it is with goat's cheese on a gourmet cracker, to which I will nod, "Yeah, that does sound pretty good." Then I will take another sample, and eventually leave the store with my pizza rolls or whatever I came there for originally. I have no more food-based analogies for you, so instead, allow me to explain how I spent my time on Final Fantasy XIV as a permanent trial player. It will be a sampler of sorts, as despite the limitations of a trial account, I managed to dip into some of the most meaningful aspects of the game that were available to me, with some aspects, I imagine, even many full-time players have not experienced for themselves. So why don't I start from the beginning, talk about my experiences with each of those aspects, and then give you my closing thoughts on what I thought about the Final Fantasy XIV trial as a whole. So, the first thing to do with any MMO is to find out what class you're going to play. I pretty much exclusively play tanks if there is a Holy Trinity, and so I started reading articles and watching videos to see what I was in for. I was initially put off to learn that the only tank class that was available to me in the trial that had a gap-closing move was the Dark Knight, which meant that I couldn't play it right off the bat because it required some story progression. I also had a hankering to use a sword and a shield, but then I saw Paladin gameplay and I was noticing them standing still to cast, and I like to be very mobile as a tank, so that pretty much left me with the Warrior, the classic angry two-hander class. So the next thing I had to do was to come up with a character that fit the Warrior's aesthetic. Character creation is very important to me, and I will spend a stupid amount of time coming up with names as well as a general theme for my characters that I will be typically hesitant to stray from. It is a role-playing game, after all. I'll really quickly mention the races, as it is an interesting topic to discuss for any game. Immediately, Final Fantasy XIV wins all the money because it is the only MMO I have ever seen to have the balls to put in a cat-girl race. This is slightly offset by the Lalafell, who are by far my least favorite tiny baby race in any game. There is a disturbing amount of tiny baby races in MMOs, so clearly there is a demand for it. But I cannot take them seriously at all. Show me all the evil babies with villain mustaches you want. I will never be able to get past the full diaper walk cycle. Elves feel a little bit strange in Final Fantasy, but they are a fantasy staple. The Aura are also an easy choice for new players, especially if you're feeling a little bit edgy, although they might take the cake for the least satisfying four-letter word to try to pronounce. That being said, I looked up a name generator for Final Fantasy XIV, as I like my characters to fit into the world, and I realized that unpronounceable names are all part of the world building. There are, of course, vanilla humans, as well as slightly bigger humans, as well as a few other options that are only available after purchase, and also Shrek. The character that I ended up making was Othir Longfang, a Viking-inspired character to fit with the giant axe-wielding warrior class. I found the character creator to be somewhat limited, as you have the classic problems of there being only two beard options, either yes or no. This killed a lot of the other character concepts that I had, as I wasn't satisfied with their finished product. And it also wasn't too long before I ended up bumping into someone who was essentially my long-lost twin brother. That being said, I don't mind it too much, as you definitely have another problem when you have a very robust character creator, in which your game ends up being filled with a bunch of immersion-breaking gabools and meme characters. It's a small gripe that I have, but I do like it when another player character appears though they fit into the setting. Anyways, I finally wait to see what Final Fantasy XIV has to offer. This opening cutscene is a great introduction. It's an amazing song, good look, starting town, amazing logos. Goofy name aside, I really like Limbs of Lamenta. So does everybody else too, apparently. It has a rather unique-looking nautical theme, with a number of great vistas, large tower-like structures with boardwalks connecting them. And it's mostly populated by sailors, pirates, and these awful-looking Shreks in yellow shirts. Originally, I had made a barge, which starts you in the far more typical-looking forest town, which I thought was fairly unremarkable by comparison, so I'm glad that I did the do-over. So, one of the first things you are made to do is to join up with the Maelstrom, which is essentially a pirates union, like a sea thug company, which is very funny to me. So you join up with the Bastards Coalition, and your first duty is to try and impress their admiral, putting you on the track to become a heroic figure not unlike the stories of old. One thing that always impressed me about FF14 was that it had the balls to try and incorporate the failure of the original 1.0 release as this sort of end-of-the-world scenario where all the original Warriors of Light disappeared, both literally and also figuratively, from the minds of all the people living in the world. It also gets reincorporated in a couple of interesting ways throughout the story that I won't spoil. One thing I like in particular is how much the game borrows from Final Fantasy XII, in terms of both its UI and its game feel. You'll notice small things, such as the transitions between maps and the fonts that it uses, as well as the markers that enemies place on you to indicate who they are attacking. You can also chain enemies together for loot, as well as your It also feels like Final Fantasy XII to play. It's kind of bizarre, considering this is a computer-based RPG system. A friend of mine who I was in a call with joked when I told him Final Fantasy XIV, where he asked if the enemies that I was fighting were walking up to me slowly and then charging up an AoE. Enemies, for whatever reason, seem to latch onto the first target that aggroed them, and they seem dedicated to try and finish their first action, even if you taunt them, giving them this weird, sticky, turn-based feeling that a lot of players seem to be able to take advantage of, especially in the dungeons. There is a definite initial sticky feeling to the combat that took me a while to get past. Almost all moves, including the warrior's first AoE, are target-based, and when used will snap you around to face the enemy, interrupting whatever movement that you might have been inputting, which makes trying to use moves while also trying to move out of an AoE kind of dangerous. Tab targeting also never seems to quite get the guy that I want, so I find myself simply clicking on targets. It's not a deal breaker, and I honestly imagine it probably feels a lot better on the controller, but I thought it was worth mentioning as it is one of the first things that I noticed while playing this game. So let's skip forward and talk about dungeons, as they are among the first challenges that you will encounter while progressing through the game. Eventually, the main storyline will bring you to the first set of 3 dungeons. When you get to that level, you are directed to a character referred to as the Smith, who is also awkwardly placed next to an NPC that offers equipment repairs, which isn't confusing at all. The Smith offers to teach you the role of your class before you queue for your first dungeon, which is honestly fine by me, as I wanted to see if there was any specific tanking mechanics that were unique to Final Fantasy XIV. As it turns out, not really, but it is a good refresher, as the last few MMOs that I played didn't really have traditional class roles. I'd recommend doing these, not only because they give you a set of really hard to replace gear, but also because it does a decent job of preparing you for a dungeon. There are also guild hests which provide a similar tutorial function, but honestly they're overkill, as the queue timer plus the minimal rewards make them feel sort of extra. So, admittedly, my first dungeon experience was a bit I'm told by just about everyone that I had talked to that the main story was the first 3 dungeons so if you want to progress, you're going to hammer those out to continue. But instead I walked into the dungeon with 2 blue mages, who proceeded to obliterate everything in one hit using 1,000 needles. And I didn't really fully understand what was going on, so I just walked through the dungeon like an awkward third wheel as everything died before I could even read their names. The next dungeon I actually got to tank, and I was urged by my party to pull pretty much every single enemy all the way up to the first boss, despite me not really knowing where that was. I was hesitant to do this, as I only had one AoE move at the time, and I expected maintaining threat from the healer to be more difficult like in other MMOs. To my surprise, in Final Fantasy XIV, you can basically spit on an enemy, and so long as your tanking stance is on, they will almost never, ever break away from you. And considering how the enemy AI works, you can actually effectively outrun the enemies to prevent any damage being done to you. This was completely baffling to me, and it still sort of is. It seems as though the developers caught onto this strategy, as many, if not most, of the harder dungeons later employ some form of which I don't really feel like is the correct solution. I mean, if a group is dungeon by style, it's possible to do this as well, although it does typically require planning. Another small gripe of mine is that most of the dungeons are locked behind the story, which I suppose isn't really a problem if all you want to do is to level up. But I genuinely enjoy tanking, and I would prefer to be able to progress through the game through dungeons if possible, as it allows me to get more comfortable with my class. That being said, the dungeons seem to pull their punches until you get to about level 50, where the enemies finally start being able to hit hard enough to really fuck you up, or they will start channeling a spell that, if completed, will start to make things really hard for you. Boss strategies on the whole for these dungeons appear to be much harder to deal with as a DPS or a healer, as the tank's HP pool really lets you get away with a lot of nonsense, especially if you're bringing potions with you. One great feature that Final Fantasy XIV has is the ability to run dungeons with a squadron of NPCs, which is really great if you want to keep running the same dungeon over and over and over again and you don't want to deal with a queue, which is especially useful if you're a DPS class, which has a much longer queue than a tank does. And this leads me into discussing the next aspect of the game that you'll run into, the Grand Companies. I really like the idea of the Grand Companies. I assume they don't play a large part in the current patch, but they will take up a significant portion of your time during the trial. You choose a faction between picking your favorite colors between black, red, or yellow. There is the Immortal Flames, led by this bull-helmeted bad fucker named Raubon. You can join up with the Maelstrom, led by Admiral Burlbib. Or there's the Twin Adders, led by, the third one. Each are essentially a military organization that you can join up with and gain ranks in by participating in world events, which gives you access to a few perks, such as emotes and items that you can use for specific crafting. They are also how you unlock your first mount. The best feature by far is the Squadron, which you are given command of past a certain rank, which are a group of NPCs that you can hire out to go on to missions and to earn experience and gain rewards. To unlock new recruits, you complete challenges, and then you review new applications in your barracks. And later on, you can dress them up in whatever uniform that you want. I went with a Final Fantasy VII Turks aesthetic, because literally everybody looks good in a suit. It becomes a daily ritual to pop in to send your team on a mission so that they can slowly progress. And as I mentioned before, you can take these characters with you to specific dungeons. I really wish that this idea was fleshed out a bit more, but from what I can tell on the wiki page, the Grand Companies appear to have been dropped in the later patches, as there appears to be a series of unattainable ranks with no rewards attached to them. I'd love to see these characters if they had a bit more dialogue, so that there was more purpose to recruiting a specific character, sort of like an Animal Crossing villager. Also, imagine if their AI was given gambits similar to Final Fantasy XII. It would probably feel more like a standard Final Fantasy game within a Final Fantasy game, where you get to pick your party members and use your limit break however you want. I could imagine people getting very invested in this system. By far, one of the best perks of the Grand Companies are the daily turn-ins, which grant a ridiculous amount of experience towards your crafting and gathering professions. And speaking of professions, so let's just go ahead and officially award Final Fantasy XIV the Does Crafting and Gathering the Best out of any MMO award. Hey, you've come a long way since 1.0, but you've earned it, buddy. So I initially discovered crafting after I stumbled into the Ixal Beast Tribe quests, as I was curious to learn why the angry green bird people who worship the objectively best primal were asking me to help. As it turns out, it's because you can help build these bird people a flying machine, which is very funny to me. These bird boys ease you into the system by giving you crafting missions that can be completed by any profession, and they have you building out components for their hot airship balloon. And by any profession, you sit there and pick up an engine mount, which seems very funny, but it is very funny. Each profession has its own crafting class, which starts out by using very basic components that you could just buy in order to craft weapons and armor and so on, and higher level recipes require more complex crafting materials. For the most part, your 3 gathering classes are able to find these raw materials, which are then refined by your crafting classes. As you level these different professions, you unlock new skills just like any other class. With gathering classes, these abilities will help you to find raw items in higher quantities as well as to improve their quality. The skills on your crafting classes will increase your progress towards completing an item, as well as to increase the chance that the item will become high quality, which is further modified by the quality of the materials you use. There is a neat minigame here, as you can expend your ability to try and give yourself the highest chance of a high quality product, which are either a statistical improvement from a standard item or a specific requirement in certain quests. After hours of crafting, you will eventually learn what your optimal crafting rotation is, only to then realize that there is a website that can do all that optimization for you. You will learn pretty quickly that you can't ignore other professions, as every profession requires components from the other. Only your armorsmith can make you rivets, and your carpenter will need to craft the lumber, and you'll eventually need to fish up a hammerhead shark and turn it into oil for some reason. Thankfully, you can level your other classes using daily turn-ins at your Grand Company or the previously mentioned Green Bird people. As a permanent trial player, your inventory is going to be completely ruled by crafting. And to a lesser extent, your endgame will also require crafting, assuming that you actually want to use the items that you find off of bosses, seeing as that you can't really sell them for money. One of the most daunting tasks I have ever undertaken in any MMO has been to try and craft endgame gear for both A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, with 99% of that struggle being due to the fact that I just didn't have access to the market board to simply buy what I was missing. Just like my ancestors, I needed to toil in the mud, collecting every iron-laced pebble in the land to build my equipment. Why go through all this trouble, you ask? It's simple. Fashion. Fashion. Style. Look. As any experienced MMO player knows, fashion is the true endgame. In this sense, the trial is only really limited by the gear that is equipable at level 60 or below. While this means that you will never wear the high-level Dark Souls armor, it also has the side effect of making your own fashions pretty unique, as not too many players are using the harder-to-craft gear from older expansions. A good portion of the player base typically uses modern-looking fashion, things from the cash shop which are a no-go for you, or nothing at all, which has been available to you from the start of the game. You're already halfway there. Your best options are going to come from either level 50 and 60 crafting, or from raids and boss trials. As I mentioned before, crafting my first set of fashionable gear was the first major milestone that I set for myself. I found a few endgame recipes and saw how they looked together, and I decided that's what I was going to go for, with no idea as to how many dozens of hours that was going to take me. Do you know how expensive it is to try to make your own Denny materia at level 50? Very expensive. I probably spent around 2 million gil just buying items to desynthesize in order to find other items that cost maybe 500 gil on the market board, only to have to grind that cash back up and do it again. Similarly, I would have to run these same few raids over and over again in order to hopefully, maybe, receive a single piece of Allagan Roots out of the 14 or so that I needed. In total, it took me about a month to create, but in the end, I was really happy with the finished product. At this point, however, I was finally starting to dip into the other tank classes, so I needed to find armor for them as well. I decided I would try to farm the Warrior of Light armor from the very first raid, as I have always been a fan of Yoshitaka Amano's artwork, and you can really get a sense of it with the colors and shapes of the set. Man, I deadass thought these websites were lying to me, because I must have run this raid over 12 times before I ever saw a piece of tank gear drop. By around 30 runs, I had actually managed to loot 4/5 of the set, as being the only tank class in the party luckily meant that I had priority. In total, I must have run Labyrinth of the Ancients 60 times before I ever saw the boots drop, and I can't even imagine what it would be like trying to grind up a DPS set in one of these raids. I had similarly also tried to grind the crafted weapons from Extreme Trials, to which I must have done Titan and Ifrit in particular about 20 times each. And then, of course, I ended up getting Ravana's and Garuda's items instead on my first or second try. There were also some more obscure items during the trial. I was on the hunt for which is an item you receive after maximizing your loyalty with all of the Luckily, my time with the board showed that I was on the and to unlock this unique quest chain, this cutscene. And I thought that this was worth showing for some reason. I think that's enough of that, as it's time to talk about the actual most important part of Final Fantasy XIV. I feel like I've been here before. Now we're into the real meat and potatoes of the MMO genre. After spending hours at the Phantasy Star Online 2 roulette wheel, and now an equivalently embarrassing amount of time at the Gold Saucer, I am now convinced that your game needs a casino for me to care at all. This casino works a little differently, as you don't really bet your earnings so much as you play mini-games for Golden Saucer Fun Bucks. Yay! There is actually a surprising amount to do here, as another milestone of mine was to get the Fenrir mount. Fenrir is a semi-prominent figure within the series, and I wanted the big icy wolf mount as it went well with my grizzled Viking man character. Anyways, this sucker's gonna set you back 1 million fun bucks, so it's time to start talking about how you're gonna earn those fat stacks. Number 1 on the checklist are the challenges which reset each week. Doing these are relatively simple, such as completing 3 mini-games, which will grant you a flat 1000 MGP. You're not the right cactus man. Get out of here. Leave! Next up is Cactpot, which is essentially a free lottery that you can enter into once weekly. And it also has its cousin, the Mini Cactpot, which are a set of daily scratch tickets that you can pull. The mini variety is what we care about, as on average they provide a much bigger payout. If you have your Grand Company squadron able to do high-level missions, one reward that you can get is this ticket that increases your winnings by 15%. Pop one of these bad boys and then scratch your ticket in a triangle pattern like this. You want to do it this way because you are trying to line up the numbers 1, 2, and 3, or 7, 8, and 9. And this pattern ensures that you have all the information that you need to guarantee that you will either get one of those two, so long as they are actually on that particular ticket. The fashion show is the real breadwinner, which allows you to win a prize of up to 60,000 MGP every week, and is made completely trivial if you follow this guide by this fine, gentle person on Reddit. Now, even with the guide, it may take you a while on a trial to get your first set of 80 or 100 judgment points, as more often than not the fashions will require you to have certain classes leveled up to at least the mid-50s, and sometimes even that won't be enough. Even after reaching Heavensward, it took me at least 6 weeks before I was able to get my first 100 points to unlock the title. Every once in a while, you will hear an announcement for an event, and these come in the form of the Ultimate Ghost Shooter minigame, an event where you have to avoid getting knocked out of the ring, effectively a less buddy Typhon, or these are quick and dirty, good rewards, and also you can also choose from a selection of fleshed out minigames, such as Golden Mahjong, which is there is Lord of Dominion, which is this weird RTS style game where you get to use the collectible minions that you can find, which also has exploitable credit to get paid out in fat stacks. Then there is Triple Triad.
Am I supposed to be doing something?
Triple Triad is a card game that was first introduced in Final Fantasy VIII. And when I found it here, I won't lie, I pretty much stopped playing the rest of the game just to see how far this thing could go. I would wait around for hours to play in the draft tournaments, and after steamrolling my first few, I was a little bit embarrassed to find out that most of the entrants were just NPCs, which took the wind out of my sails a little bit. On rare occasions, you will actually get a tournament full of actual players, but you are still at the whims of the game as to what rules you are playing by. While I enjoy most of the rules of Triple Triad, one rule which I almost never see, which was something of a staple back in Final Fantasy VIII, is the Open rule, which allows you to see the cards that your opponent is using. In a traditional card game, this rule would suck wild amounts of ass. But I've always seen Triple Triad as a game more similar to something like chess, but with deck building elements. It is a game of patience that involves exploiting whatever you or your enemy has set up. With the same plus rules on, any two sets of numbers that touch each other has a chance of starting a chain reaction that will essentially win you the game. And without being able to see what your opponent is going to place, anything that you try to set up will almost definitely blow up in your face. I have found that the best strategy in this case is to place your cards in such a way as to avoid this from happening entirely, and then hope to hell that your opponent leaves you an opening so that you can place a card that they couldn't see, and then completely devastate them in one move. It's still a lot of fun, but my preference is for the original, as it lets you bully everyone into using whatever awful rule set that you've concocted. So the surprise winner of the casino is Chocobo Racing. At first I only did this because the challenges offered a massive payout towards my mount, but by the time I was done, I was actually spending more points than I was making. Chocobo Racing is essentially a really slow, janky version of Mario Kart, and I hate Mario Kart, so I have no idea why I like this so much. There's an interesting Pokemon-esque breeding mechanic, which allows you to invest a stupid amount of time into creating the genetic Super Chocobo. You can teach your Chocobo a utility skill or a passive that it can use during the race, such as a speed boost or increased stamina so it can run for longer. And you can also inherit one of these abilities from the Chocobo's parent. You can further customize your stats by feeding your Chocobo certain foods, so there's actually a surprising number of builds that you can come up with. My Chocobo in particular uses an ability called Super Sprint, which when used maxes out your speed by burning through all of your stamina rapidly, so almost all of my other stat investments are going to go towards stamina, minimizing speed as it doesn't affect Super Sprint at all. It works pretty well most of the time, and I think there was something else that I was doing? Oh right, the mount. After about a month of grinding, I saved up my 1 million funds and purchased my wolf, and for the first time I was really beginning to feel invested. A month later, I was at 1 million in this journey, and so I ended up buying every other prize the casino had, including this ridiculous thing, which reminds me of the best joke that Marbot ever made about every time I won.
Very good. And do you believe in
So this is the section of the video that I'm most interested to talk about. The story seems to be something that a lot of players are invested in. I have a few criticisms I'd like to put on my chest. If you'd like to skip ahead, please feel free. You can also take the following with a grain of salt, because I have only completed what story was available up this point. Without getting into the story, the biggest gripe isn't with the story itself, but with what's important. In order to unlock content in this game, be it the raids, dungeons, or even certain classes, you need to get to a certain point in the story. This is no small time investment either, as there are something like 170 some odd quests before you even reach the end game of A Realm Reborn. If this were a single player game, I would have no problem at all going through the story at my own pace, which is definitely what the community asks you to do, and that was no secret to me when I started playing. That being said, having a very linear story set in an open world MMO feels like a strange choice, and it started to feel like a chore that I had to keep hacking away in order to get to the point where I could play with my friends, which is why I started playing Ninja. One of my friends in particular ended up quitting the game at around level 40, because when they learned how much of the story they had to catch up on, it seemed too daunting for them to continue. It also doesn't help that a lot of the earliest parts in the story of A Realm is sort of plot. By the time that I got to the introduction of the city, I had already started treating these story quests like an obstacle. I ended up looking up the main quest line and seeing what trials and dungeons they unlocked and when, and then I would rush through until I could queue as a tank in something new, as I wanted a change of scenery. I did eventually go back to the inn and then re-watch the cutscenes that I had skipped all the way up to Heaven's Gate, and nor do I feel like I have missed out on the story by skipping those cutscenes during the dungeons. A Realm Reborn is definitely the big offender here, especially the grind at the end towards unlocking Heavensward, as it really does begin to feel like a grind. My biggest surprises came from Castrum Meridianum and the Praetorium, which serve as the end to the original story of Final Fantasy XIV, and also feature unskippable cutscenes that you have to watch each time that you come here. This includes a few that come during the middle of a poll, which made me absolutely shit my pants the first time I was a tank, as all I could do was imagine an army of invisible assholes kicking my head in the whole time while the game was busy showing me a shot of the sky. It sucks because the rewards for these dungeons are great, and so there's a lot of incentive to keep doing them again and again, although I wish the rewards were based on clearing a long and difficult dungeon and not sitting through what feels like an hour-long cutscene. On a secondary note, it feels a little strange to make raid content a part of the main story, as I am used to MMOs having some players who are only marginally interested in the PvE content, and might play a game for years without ever doing something like a raid. I assume my opinion here is very unpopular, but I also don't feel like I'm 100% alone either, as it would seem that there is at least some demand in skipping the story altogether, although I would never recommend doing that. My preference would be to have no dungeons at all as part of the main story, as I don't really like the idea of breaking up the pacing of the story by adding in a queue timer. Alternatively, I'd replace those quests with a single-player version of the dungeon that you would run through with the story NPCs, as I think that would help to get you more attached to those characters, as well as not force you to queue up for a dungeon if you aren't up to dealing with other people. I get like that sometimes, where it's late at night and I just want to play something as I begin to wind down for bed, and I don't really have the energy to work with a party or potentially make mistakes in front of them, or whatever else might happen. Alright, I am done having a baby boy meltdown. If you think that I was too unfair in this section, feel free to unload on me in the comments, but for now I'm going to move on to the most important part of any MMO, and that is the setting. The setting of Final Fantasy XIV is fantastic, and it is easily the strongest aspect of the game. You can tell that this game was made for the fans, and it was probably made by the fans as well. There is an incredible amount of love that is put into the reimaginings of some of the series' most memorable characters, as well as the music themes, which I will get into a bit later. Final Fantasy as a franchise is well known for its reuse and reincorporation of certain character designs, which gives it a very strong library of references to draw upon when building its world. I mentioned the Final Fantasy XII references before, and you can see a good bit of it in the designs of the Garlean Empire, as well as obvious Final Fantasy VI references, with certain models and even concepts being faithfully recreated, such as the Magitech. The strongest of these references are the Primals, who as a group serve as the original antagonists of the setting alongside the Empire, and are also the largest demonstrable threat to the people living in this world. They are also essentially near-immortal godlike entities that have influence over a specific tribe of beast men. With mind control-like influence over their followers, they are able to resurrect themselves so that they can enact their revenge on the land and the people around them, making them more like natural disasters that can only really be mitigated rather than fully dealt with. This is also the in-game lore reason as to why many of the bosses can be fought over and over again, which I think is really clever. I cannot stress enough how much I like the core concept of the Primals and the influence these godlike creatures have over their followers, and it's really cool to see how this idea gets expanded upon as the story keeps progressing, even into the current patch. With the Primals in mind, I am now going to reach in and pull out a double sampler here as I talk about my two favorite aspects of literally any video game. As a developer, the only thing that you need to put into a video game to make me happy is at least one medium to above average boss with a slapper of a boss theme, and this game has both of those things in spades. I've already gushed a little bit about the Primals, but man, what a fucking cool way to let your fans kick the heads off of all their favorite summons and bosses. Trials are probably my favorite format for a boss fight in an MMO. Setting aside the occasional 30-minute queue, sometimes all I want is to be able to re-challenge a single boss because I liked fighting that boss so much. and I don't really want to spend any time in a dungeon or a raid to get to that fight. I feel like Square really busts out the big guns for the trials in particular too, as you can get really merciless with the difficulty if all you are fighting is a single boss. This is where I think that A Realm Reborn actually really shines, as it has access to the biggest list of fan favorites, and it doesn't seem to pull its punches on the extreme trials. So let's talk about a few. Titan, my boy, whom I will grapple with to the last, is this huge sumo wrestler looking mountain Oni, who is looking to grind some overdwellers under his heel. His fight involves 5 distinct phases, each of which turn up the heat a little bit more as he slowly breaks away the stage. And unlike some later boss fights which do nearly the same thing, your body isn't going to be neatly recovered so that you can easily be revived by your healers. No, fuck that, you are just dead, and that's great. Did I mention this guy has 5 boss themes, 1 for each phase? One thing I am not the biggest fan of is a mechanic called Echo, which slowly increases your stats as your group continues to wipe. I don't really like the idea of rewarding the players for dying. Also, I don't know about you, but when you get to a frustrating boss in any other video game, would you get the same catharsis for finally winning if you had to use Game Shark to give yourself extra health and damage? No, I want to win without cheating. I've encountered almost every single boss in A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, and I can say that most of them are of really high quality, and I'd love to have done them when they were still considered progression. As a trial player, the only boss that was available to me that I haven't been able to complete is Bahamut, as well as some of his associated trials, as he appears to be the one piece of legacy content that doesn't have any queues associated with him. And one boss partway through the second coil is particularly hard to do without a certain number of players being in your party. So without access to Party Finder, trying to find people to do this without a Discord server was a little bit too hard for me. Alright, so, soundtrack. So Final Fantasy XIV has one of the largest libraries of original music out of any game that I have ever played. You could easily listen to nothing but tracks from this game all day, and you wouldn't get bored with it. For some reason, the music in the game doesn't loop, which was apparently an intentional design decision by the game's lead composer and sound director, who is a beautiful boy, by the way. Nothing but love from me. I do still wish it was an option though, as my brain has a condition that needs there to be a constant white noise around me, so instead I usually end up loading up a playlist of Final Fantasy music from the other games while I'm playing. A lot of the boss tracks tend to include lyrics of some kind, and I tend to find that very distracting, especially if I'm on call with other people or trying to teach someone what to do, and so I'll end up being forced to turn the music down or off entirely. You know, that's sort of the weird thing about Final Fantasy XIV music, is that I actually end up listening to it more outside of the game than I do while I'm actually playing it. Also, if you didn't know, you can listen to almost every single main series Final Fantasy song on Spotify for free, including Final Fantasy XIV and all of its expansions. I decided I would leave one last section to talk about relic weapons. This is the last major milestone that I attempted to complete, and it also represents the longest non-main storyline quest that you can engage in on your trial. I also think I just needed a place to talk about it because of how much time I spent on these damn things, and I really